Hi friends, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about the 9 books that I read with my patrons this year. I just want to reflect on the experience of reading these books, wrap them up all in one video. I did put so much work into all of these books and to thinking about all of these texts, and that content is patron exclusive, so I wanted to share in some way what I learned. Do you know what I mean? I just wanted to reflect on these books and share these books with you. So the first book that we opened up the year with was Alana, The First Adventure by Tamora Pierce. So this is an old favorite for me. This is a piece of young adult fantasy literature that is near and dear to my heart, and it was a lot of fun to read this with a group of people and to get other adults' reactions to it, because I always worry that my nostalgia for this clouds my judgment. I do think that there are things that I definitely see now as an adult reader that obviously I wouldn't have as a child, and I wouldn't have as a reader, like just reading for shits and giggles. What we have here is definitely of its time. I feel like Tamora Pierce has always been a feminist thinker, a feminist writer. However, her feminism is always of the time. Like, she continues to learn and to grow and to listen and to incorporate what she's learning into her feminist writing. This feels very like girls can do anything boys can do kind of feminism. So Alana switches places with her twin brother to masquerade as a boy and basically train for the job of knight, because girls are not allowed to have that role. They're not allowed to have that job. She must do it in secret and conceal her gender. If Pierce were writing something like this now, we would have a more nuanced look at gender as performative. Perhaps Alana would be trans or non-binary, opposed to being a girl pretending to be a boy. I think that it's interesting to look at this as a piece of literature in and of itself, and then also if you're thinking about this as a trans narrative, there's quite a big queer interest in Tamora Pierce. A lot of folks find one scene in here quite upsetting. Alana has just gotten her period and she's talking to a healer and she's like, well, I'll just use my magic to make my period not happen. And the person is like, well, you're female, so you're gonna stay female and you can't change that. Like, you can't change your gender because the gods gave it to you. You were born that way. It's one of those things where I hadn't critically thought about that aspect specifically until this reading of the text. And this is one of those texts where, as a bookseller, I had a lot of nostalgia for it, and I would recommend it to folks looking for stuff like this for girls in their life. Now I would be very hesitant to give this to a young person without being a resource for them there as well. I would definitely buddy read this with a kid, and I would help them to break down and think about maybe what's wrong with Mrs. Cooper's statements about sex being the determining factor of your gender. I revisit this book over and over again. This is probably a book that I have literally read 100 times. I really, really enjoyed having that discussion as a group, like having this opportunity to visit it with new eyes, to talk about it, because I feel like oftentimes a lot of my reading, especially my reading as a kid, I didn't talk about the books that I read with anyone. So reading this with a group and talking about it was an interesting new experience that I really, really enjoyed. Then we read Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger. So obviously this is not, I think, most people's encounter with J.D. Salinger. Most people have to or are forced to read Catcher in the Rye. And so it was interesting to take a step away from that much more popular work and to read something else by J.D. Salinger. So Franny and Zooey is actually a novella and a short story about Franny and Zooey. Franny is a woman having a nervous breakdown. Zooey is her brother. I did struggle a little bit with this text. I found the writing a little bit pretentious, but I did really enjoy looking at Franny in particular. Basically, Franny is picked up by her boyfriend at the train station and they go out for this disastrous lunch, and the whole time she is thinking about performing the role of girlfriend, how, I guess, disconnected her emotions are from how she is supposed to perform. Zooey I didn't enjoy so much. I think overall it was interesting to read Franny and Zooey just because it did sort of push me out of my comfort zone, I suppose. Like, I think so much of my school reading was a lot of these classics, right? Which dead white men in a lot of cases. So as an adult, I have definitely not really taken to seeking those texts out for myself unless I have another angle. Like, I'm definitely reading a lot more of the like new releases, or like if I'm looking at a backlist, I'm looking at a backlist for a woman or an author of color to sort of fill in the gaps in my reading that my education failed to fill in. And so there are certain texts that like I never picked up and I never would have picked up. This book club has challenged me to read some of these texts and to engage with them. One of those texts that I very much would not have picked up, Lord of the Flies by William Golding. So this is the text that I managed to escape in high school. I was never forced to read this in high school, and I feel like that definitely changed my reaction to the text. I had no previous like negative associations with it or positive associations. Like, I really liked a lot of the books that I read in high school. I was always a book nerd. I had no preconceived ideas. I obviously knew like the larger plot. Boys abandoned on an island, start a new civilization, mayhem ensues. What I didn't realize, and I probably wouldn't have picked up on because I doubt a colonial reading would have been applied in high school when this book is typically read. I feel like a gendered reading is probably pretty common of this text. Like, look at what happens to boys when you leave them alone. They reproduce society and then they go mad and they start killing things. But I think what we have here is this conversation about civilization, who is civilized, what it means to be civilized, how racist that is. Basically, up until this one line, I was like, oh, I would love to be a high school, like there's so much I feel like you could pull out. I would love to be a high school teacher and to have this text. There's so much meat here. There's so much to pull apart and to teach. And then there was this one line, this is the line that like completely changed my relationship with this book because I was fully not expecting it. And it's, quote, "Which is better, to be a pack of painted N-words, like you are, or to be sensible like Ralph is?" That is the nail in the coffin. Like, if you didn't know that this is looking at colonialism, it's looking at racism, and you can do that reading, like, how racist the whole colonial narrative, the whole colonial project is. You got it there from Piggy's mouth. It was an interesting read. And again, it's kind of something that I'm grateful to have read because it is such a cultural touchstone and I never would have picked it up. The next book that we read is The Strange Library by Haruki Murakami. This is a neat little text. There are several different editions and the illustrations in them are different. And it was fascinating to talk about this text, which is on the surface quite simple. This little boy goes into the library and he goes into the depths of the library and then he gets stuck with this impossible task and he has to try and escape. There's so much happening here, and the interesting thing that I think I enjoyed talking the most about, because we had different people all over the place picking up different editions. There is the US, the UK, and then there's a Japanese edition. Japanese edition, the illustrations look like they're meant for children, like it's meant to be a children's book, but it's a fucking horrifying text. Like, this is like flat out horrifying. I don't know that I would give this to a kid and be like, have fun with this. I believe it's the UK edition has a lot of photos, more black and white, and this edition is a lot of like abstract photos, things zoomed in way too close, things pixelated so you can't really tell what it is. And I think that was one of the most fun and rewarding things about reading this as a group, was everybody had a different edition, and we got to talk about how the illustrations impacted our experience. And I think I read this 2 or 3 times in the process of prepping for this video. It's just such a fascinating little text, and I think that if you're looking for a good book club book, this is one of those weird little texts that, like, it's simple and quick enough for people to get through, but there's so much that you can do, so much that you can talk about. I really, really enjoyed this. And again, I haven't super enjoyed Murakami's works. I've read a couple of them now, and I don't love how he treats women, so he's not the author that I would reach for if I wanted to explore Japanese translated fiction. And keeping on with that, trying something different, is the absolute win from this year. We read Bailey's Cafe. This is such an interesting text. I think this has to go on my favorite books of the year, to be honest with you. Bailey's Cafe is like a way station. It's somewhere between life and death, and people end up in this cafe who are sort of down on their luck. They either go back out the front door when they have got what they needed from the cafe, or they go out the back door into the void. And so this book follows several characters, several women who have experienced, several Black women in America, for the most part, who have experienced some sort of trauma. And we get to see many different walks of life, many different stories. This is such a fascinating concept. They're like loosely interconnected stories because of the constant of the cafe. Like, I had never heard of Gloria Naylor before. This isn't a new release, right? It's older fiction. This phenomenal piece of fiction only came into my life because of this book club. And like, I am so excited. I am so excited about the writing and her storytelling that I have so many things on my list now that I'm looking for, because I want to read more of her work. We talked a lot about the different women's stories, the different positions that they were in. I feel like because each sort of chapter, each little vignette is about a different woman, it's hard to say what this is about without spoiling any of those specifics. Like, if you love character over plot, like, you are here for character, you are here for snapshots, I think this is an interesting read. And like, the fact that they're strung together because everybody's sort of in this limbo space of the cafe is interesting. This is another phenomenal book club read. Then we read The End We Start From by Megan Hunter. This is a tiny novel that is somewhat apocalyptic. It's set in a climate crisis related disaster in which London has flooded just as the unnamed mother, our protagonist, is giving birth to her first child. They are fleeing, they are living in refugee camps, they are finding other mothers, other young people. So it's based on this T.S. Eliot poem. This encouraged me to go and read some T.S. Eliot, the 4 quartets from T.S. Eliot. It was exciting to do that little research rabbit hole for this. Like, was this fine as a text before I went and did the research? Yes, 100%. It works as like this weird little almost poetic musing on motherhood, on friendship, on relationships, on climate crisis, and the impact of being a refugee, like the experience of being a refugee. But then going and looking for the poetry that gave this the title. It's literally the framing piece of this text. It's the first thing we see. We open it up to a quotation from Little Gidding, the 5th movement of the final poem in the 4 quartets. Having that opportunity to sort of stretch my little academic legs and go down this little rabbit hole and read and reread this text. It was such a fun exercise. Really makes me miss school. I really, really liked this experience. Then In time for spooky season, we read Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are other tales of terror in here. I only read Jekyll and Hyde for the book club. So this was a piece that I had read several times before. However, reading it this time, I think specifically because I'm hosting the book club and I am looking for things to talk about, looking for things to research and to expand on, to try and find questions, I end up reading these texts a little bit differently as like a book club host opposed to like a student reading this for class or just a reader reading for the fun of reading. I've had this moment where I thought I was being quite clever in reading Dr. Jekyll as a secret gay. And it turns out that in my research, in the context of the time, that is also what readers would have assumed. Like, so Dr. Jekyll talks about how he has these secrets that he must conceal, and then he's seen down by the river at night. So like he's cruising for gay sex, and like that was my reading of it, and I thought I was quite clever, and it turns out the contemporary audience for this would also have thought that. It couldn't be printed in the text, obviously, because gay was not okay at this time, but that is very much what the original audience would have gotten out of it as well. I didn't get into it in the live discussion of it, but the idea of Jekyll having to hide this aspect of himself because it's socially unacceptable, like I think that's one of the reasons that this has staying power, is because the idea of having a secret self is still very real. We also talked about how it's super relevant in online spaces, how you can be a doctor in the office in front of all your friends, hoity-toity socialite, but then you go sit behind your computer screen in the forums and spew trash and hate at people anonymously, and how that hide aspect of our personalities very much still exists, is very much still a reality for folks. I think it's interesting. It's interesting how well this has aged. Because I feel like also at the time, there's this preoccupation with science. Like in a lot of the texts around this time, you'll see a preoccupation with science, like a skepticism of science, that Enlightenment is taking away a lot of the mysteries, and it's putting this like skepticism and fear in people about what humans are capable of doing versus what like God just does to you, right? Like that like separation of the religious and the miraculous from like the cold hard facts of science. Feel like that's sort of what we're getting at with this text also, is that Hyde is working this like fancy science and playing God almost, and trying to separate and create a person, separate his sin from himself. But then at the same time, it still works today with being like the troll behind the computer screen. So loved it. I just did a live show for The We Free Men by Terry Pratchett. This was such a fun read. We have a young girl named Tiffany Aching whose grandmother has recently died, and then she learns that she is the new hag of the chalk. She's the witch of the chalk, and she is going to have to learn how to patrol the edges, basically, and she ends up going on this adventure into this parasitic dream world to get her brother back from the witch. She's like the fairy queen, basically, but it's like that evil witch sort of trope in folk and fairy stories, and this was just so much fun. This was so much fun, and it also has me excited to read more Pratchett. It has me excited specifically to explore the witch series within the Discworld. I am now on some email lists at the local used bookstores looking to fill in the witch series, because I'm curious about how magic works in this world. I talked a lot about gender and magic in this series, because Pratchett himself talked a lot about how women who are magic are positioned as evil in a lot of fantasy. There are wizards, and they are often good, and then there are witches, and they are like eating children and putting warts on you. Like the Gandalf versus the witch in Hansel and Gretel is basically what we have. He talked about how, obviously I'm paraphrasing and he said this so much more eloquently, but he talked about how this idea of what a witch is baked into the fantasy genre, and how he wanted to change that and equalize witches and wizards in his world. And I'm curious now if he has done that, because based on what I've heard, the wizards attend an unseen university. They have institutionalized, standardized wizarding, and witches tend to avoid using magic from what I have seen just in reading Tiffany Aching. Again, I've only dipped my toe in, but now I'm so curious because Pratchett has made this statement. I want to see if it's true. Do I agree? If witches are basically trying to avoid doing magic, if witches are there more to patrol the edges and keep people safe, what are wizards doing? What do wizards do with their magic? Like, I'm so curious if he has truly achieved what he set out to do in equalizing witches and wizards in a fantasy space and like subverting and playing with that consciously. I feel like I'm so excited for all of his works because you can see just in this book alone how well versed he is in the genre. I see references to Narnia, I see references to Lord of the Rings, I see references to the Childe Roland fairy tale. This is a human well versed in his genre, subverting it with humor. And so I'm excited to see what he continues to do. I'm excited to see also, because these are so popular, this is the kind of text that if he is executing what I sort of hope he's executing, this could be quite powerful. These could be really interesting teaching tools. This could be the next Dark Tower read-along series on my channel. You know, read the Discworld. I don't want to commit to something like that just yet. I want to read a few more by myself first, but like this has me excited in a way that I haven't been excited about a big project in a long time. Like, I have big projects that I want to do, but they almost seem they need way more love than I can give them, but because Terry Pratchett is so readable, it's very tempting to like take some of these side projects that I've been sort of quietly working on in the background and just like, let's just focus on something fun and light. So like I love that won the vote. I love that I got to read that and have the opportunity to think about that text. The last book I have here is in the process of being read, and that is Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. We have sapphic vampires, and this is exciting. I'm excited about this because I have a very early video on my channel where I talk about Dracula. Like, I talked about gender in Dracula and how interesting it was that the female vampires become like the penetrator with their fangs. And I have a lot of comments on that video that are just like, feminist trash, ruining classic literature. Like, but that's exactly why people are still studying it, is because it is so subversive. Like, the idea of women being sexual, of women being penetrators, of women having power, period, of women's sexual power, especially when it was written. It's so fascinating to read. And Carmilla just like is the cherry on top of that because we have gay vampires. They're like straight up in love with each other, panting, romantic eye contact, kissing each other on the neck. These are not gal pals. These are gay lady vampires. It's so much fun. It's so much fun. And like, how much queer literature is there from this time? It's beautiful. It's wonderful. I'm loving it. I'm so excited to talk about it. I haven't done the live show for it yet. I'm excited that I've had the opportunity to read this. I love how all over the place these books have been. Like, what a mix. What a mix of texts for this year. I've had so much fun. Basically, I just wanted to share with you all what I had learned, what I had read with this book club. I'm just so pleased that we managed to read 9 books. I am so glad folks came along with me on the journey. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments down below, have you read any of these books? Do you love any of these books? Thank you, patrons, for following along with this throughout the year. I really appreciate when you show up and you chat with me. I love it. It's so good. And like, you've put in a lot of work too. Like, you've read some of these books and you've participated, so good on you. I hope you are all doing well, that you are staying safe, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye!